Hello, my name is Georgina Rose, and welcome to the Dot Darling YouTube channel. On this channel, we discuss everything related to magic, mysticism, religion, and everything on the fringes of esoterica. This video is a continuation of my ongoing Occult 101 series, which is the flagship series on this channel where I discuss beginner introductions to complex esoteric topics so you can jump off into further research. So, in this video, I'm going to be talking about something that people kind of just assume is something completely different than it actually is, and are surprised when they find out that it's something people still do. That would be the idea of alchemy. In our minds, I think most people think of alchemy as some primitive, proto-scientific thing that no one in a sane mind would ever do, right? They think it was like some weird thing where people were like injecting mercury into their veins and like thinking they'll live forever only to die a horrible death. And I mean, to some extent, people were doing some crazy dangerous stuff for alchemy, but it actually was a little more important. And there's a reason why people even call it the predecessor to science. And, you know, it's actually not even just like mixing things in a lab. I think a lot of people think alchemy is always mixing things in a lab, and that's also not true. But yeah, let's get into it, because alchemy is a key part of Western esotericism or the Western mystery tradition. And yeah, I mean, it's something that's way more complicated than I think people think it is. So I think it's worth discussing. To begin, the reason why people have this picture of alchemy as like a crazy person in a lab, like mixing things, is because alchemy, or physical alchemy, very much was that. In fact, there are multiple things that relate to alchemy that are part of the alchemical tradition. That is physical alchemy, that's what you're thinking of, spiritual alchemy, which is about purification of the soul, and the philosophy of alchemy. So when we're talking about physical alchemy, because I think that's what people are most familiar with, we are talking about essentially mixing things together in order to purify them. The key idea of alchemy is that you could combine things together, purify them, and then create something better. So a lot of the times this was using ideas like turning lead into gold. And there are actually a number of techniques that alchemists used in order to do this. Specifically, there's one called a spaergic that is actually still used in some plant medicine systems, where you take something, you make a tincture of it, and then you like take the material you used to make the tincture, you burn it, you destroy it, and then you use that burnt material in a new thing. So you've basically taken the material, you've extracted it, you've purified it, and then you've destroyed it, purifying it further, and then you use that purified form to create something even better. As well, a lot of these techniques we're familiar with, using tinctures, salves, extractions, and even techniques used in modern perfumery actually come from the alchemy labs of Europe. There are a lot of different techniques, and to be clear, the majority of modern people who actually call themselves alchemists are not doing any of these practices, but these practices did lay the philosophical foundation for the alchemist movement and all the spiritual alchemy that people very much still do. And yes, alchemy labs used a lot of dangerous materials that we would not use today, but a number of them are still used in herbal medicine, and a number of things that modern science uses are actually originated in the alchemy labs by the madmen. Alchemy, of course, has existed for a very long time. The first ideas of alchemy actually predate the Abrahamic tradition. You see alchemy-type techniques in ancient Europe, in ancient Iran, and in a number of other religious traditions. But when we think of alchemy, like in the modern sense, we are really thinking of stuff that was happening during the medieval and the Renaissance period in Europe. We are thinking of a very specific tradition. And what else was going on at this time? There was actually a lot of interest in mysticism at this period of time, with the entire grimoire tradition gaining prominence. As well, astrology was taken seriously as a sacred science at this time. A lot of these core ideas that we think of as Western esotericism were really forming and growing at the time alchemy was picking up. As well, neoplatonism, or a sort of more modern interpretation of the philosophies of Plato, were gaining a lot of prominence as well. If you actually look at the philosophical bases of the system of Hermeticism, and the Hermetic tradition actually fuses Egyptian and Abrahamic ideals, and was allegedly created by a mystical man who is either real or a mythic figure, depending on how you slice it, named Hermes Trismegistus, that had a lot of these core ideas about connectedness was going on at the same time. And so Hermetic philosophy and alchemical philosophy actually overlap extensively. And if you are doing Hermetic magical techniques, which the majority of modern occultists are, you actually are using a lot of alchemical techniques. But let's go back to that core of alchemy that I was discussing. Alchemy is taking the impure and turning it into the pure, and transmuting things into other things. Transmutation as a concept is the idea of changing something into another thing. And when we look at a lot of magical techniques, what are you doing but transmutation? You are taking something something and turning it into something else. As well, we understand that purification is a core ritual principle in most occult traditions. If we look to the ancient Greeks, there was a tradition known as miasma and catharsis. Well, not a tradition, but an idea in most traditions where basically throughout our lives we accrue spiritual pollution that we must remove through catharsis and then become pure. And when we become pure, we come closer to the gods. In fact, the entire pagan idea of striving towards virtue to purify your soul is kind of alchemical. So in this idea, basically, there are these ideas called virtues that are good things that are created by the gods. And whenever you do something virtuous, you get closer to the gods. And when you do something virtuous, you actually are purifying your soul. That's alchemical. As well, within the Islamic tradition, there is the idea of the purification of the heart. This is very core to a lot of Sufi or Islamic mystical ideas that basically states that within our hearts, our spiritual hearts, there are diseases or maladies. And these are accrued when we do things that are against God. Specifically, some would be envy. As we know, envy, when you envy someone, you want to be someone, you actually become a darker, corrupted, and toxic person. It corrupts you from the inside out. I don't remember who said this, but there's a famous writer that said, envy is the one sin that brings you no pleasure. So what is envy but a disease? And how do you remove these diseases in the Islamic tradition? You get closer to Allah, their God, and that actually removes those diseases from your heart, making your heart pure and lighter. And when we look to the ancient Egyptian tradition, we understood that when you do evil acts, your heart gains weight. And when you die, you are having your heart weighed against a feather on a scale by the gods. And this determines whether you are allowed to have a good afterlife or a bad afterlife. As well, we understand in Eastern and Theosophic traditions and some Western traditions, as the East has influenced the West, the West and East are not entirely separate in spiritual blocks, though often they are, but there are still overlaps. You understand that throughout your life you accrue karma. And specifically in the Buddhist tradition, if you have bad karma, you go through a hell, and then that hell tortures you until that karma is gone, and then you reincarnate. You may not necessarily reincarnate in this exact form or in the exact same way, but basically like you're going through an eternal process, an endless looping of hells, life, so on, reincarnation, until you are purified. And this process, or samsara, or the turning of the wheel, is just basically you reincarnate until you're better and better and better. And then when you are wholly purified, you are able to escape the cycle and achieve enlightenment and go to nirvana. And nirvana is annihilation of the soul and closeness to the Godhead. So this idea of purifying the impure is a spiritual context that exists everywhere. I mean, even in the Christian tradition, right? You get a sin, you go to confession, it's wiped, and then you take the Eucharist and you've united with God again. All of that is alchemical. And I think it's no surprise that the idea of using the impure to create the pure became so popular amongst the Christians at this time. Because what is the Christian journey if not that? As I mentioned, the sacrament of confession kind of works in this way. So it doesn't surprise me that Christians really picked up on this. As well, Christians at the time were very influenced by neoplatonism. So Plato was an ancient pagan philosopher, and if you've ever taken any sort of philosophy or government class, you've heard of this guy. But he also is a deeply spiritual figure. He taught a spiritual tradition as well as a political and a societal one. In fact, they kind of all link together. He was a devout pagan, despite what many people tell you. And while he was a monist, or someone who believed all things are one, he was still a pagan. You can believe all things are one, or all the gods are faces of one thing, and still technically be a polytheist, because you're still believing in different forms and different gods. And Plato definitely had this mindset. But Plato, of course, had this idea of virtue ethics. And virtue ethics, as I explained, is all about goodness and getting closer to the gods and like right and wrong. And so all of morality and all of like the Western philosophic traditions, ideas of morality come from Plato, a deeply Hellenic pagan philosopher. And when you look at so many Hellenic pagan rituals through Greece and through Rome, and even through areas that were influenced by that empire, you know, you see this heavy Platonic stuff in the spiritual. There's a process known as ascesis, and I recently read this really good book that I talked about on Twitter that talked a lot about this as like, you know, the journey of purifying your soul and getting close to God in the Platonic tradition. And yeah, I mean, it's kind of alchemical, right? The idea that you know, turn yourself from something impure to pure. That's alchemical. And so Christians, you know, they're reading Plato, and Plato did heavily influence the entire philosophical tradition of the West. I would say it's where Western morality really comes from. I don't think it actually comes from Christianity or Judeo-Christianity or whatever nonsense people say. That's just not true. It really does come from Plato. And Christians, you know, they're reading Plato, they like it. And so when they get into alchemy and they see these ancient techniques and they, you know, innovate them, they're pulling so much from Plato that really alchemy is as much a core of Western esotericism as it is of Christian mysticism. In fact, when it comes to Christian views on alchemy, a lot of them actually reject it as heretical. So obviously, within Christianity, there's this idea of heresy, or things that go against doctrine. Now, if you are not a Christian who, follows doctrine, being called a heretic doesn't really bother you. But for people who are members of churches, specifically the Catholic or Orthodox Church, being called a heretic is a big deal. Because in those churches, you actually need those sacraments from those churches in order to remain pure and go to heaven after you die. And so being called a heretic was a big deal. And people were calling the alchemist heretics left and right, especially because a number of Gnostics were embracing philosophies like Hermeticism and certain ideas like Gnosticism. So Gnosticism is important in the alchemy conversation because the Gnostic cult was very alchemical. So the Gnostics are a cult that originates from early Christianity and really has extended onwards into the modern day in various forms that comes from the core idea that there is this idea of the demiurge. So there is, the creator god, the highest god, and then there is the demiurge, a false god that rules over this realm. And many people secretly worship the demiurge, when in reality they need to worship the higher god. And so Gnosticism, poses this interesting idea that there is an evil god ruling over this world that people are falsely worshiping. Now, there are some Christian Gnostics who argue that, the god people are worshiping is the demiurge, and this higher god is actually Christ. So they'll say, the demiurge is like the god of the Old Testament, or the god that people are praying to when they're not thinking about it. And then Jesus is, of course, this higher god. Now, there are other interpretations that can actually get kind of like God and Jesus are both the demiurge and there's a higher God beyond them. I mean, that's obviously a lot more controversial. And there are a number of kind of Gnostic cults that do go in a sort of Luciferian direction, but still the majority of Gnostic cults are more in this Jesus is the higher God type category. I mean, most Gnostics still consider themselves true Christians. Not all Gnosticism has that kind of Luciferian edge. It's just certain people do that. And, the Gnostic cults also have a lot of variety. A lot of cults that, just varied from Christian doctrine in various ways. Say they disagreed on the Trinity, or they disagreed on, the idea of sacraments. There are some Gnostics who dislike the idea that you go to a priest and you should just be able to pray to God directly. And that is actually, a form of idolatry to go to a priest to say the priest can do the miracles of God, right? There's ideas like that get thrown in with Gnosticism. But the core of Gnosticism that kind of overarches all of these groups is that finding gnosis, or wisdom, is a key part of the journey. And so if you're seeking out gnosis, you're seeking out wisdom, and you're doing that outside of the confines of the traditional church, often what you're going to do is you're going to do esoteric stuff. And at the time, alchemy was the thing to do. So these people were doing physical alchemy, like the laboratory stuff, right? They were using the beakers and, making all these concoctions, right? There were a number of alchemical things that were used for all sorts of stuff, right? Some people use them to cure depression. Some people used them to attract love. I mean, a lot of herbal folk magic stuff that we think of in alchemy overlap in this regard, but there were also people who were doing it to see if they could transform things into other things. That's the big thing people think of when they think of alchemy. It's not the other things they were doing. They think of okay, well, how are we creating this mythical thing called the Philosopher's Stone? How are we creating there was a big thing they were trying to do where they were trying to create an immortality potion, and all these wild things the alchemists were trying to do, a lot to not success. But they were interested in knowledge. They were interested in maybe we could mix these things and replicate the divine process of purification. Because when we think about, those ritual stuff I was talking about, those spiritual stuff I'm talking about, this idea of purifying the impure is a spiritual process. And they're well, if as above, so below, a core part of Hermetic philosophy that they were all kind of believing in is true, then we should be able to do this with physical items. And so there were a lot of experiments amongst the alchemists, some successful, some not. And they used all sorts of different techniques to process herbs, metals, and there is, use of things like lead, sulfur. There's a lot of different things that they were using in alchemy. And the idea of the elements was also very important. The elements come up a lot in Western esotericism, but there is no tradition in which they have such a high importance as they do in the alchemical tradition. This idea of elemental concepts is really, really critical. Now, the elements and the different things they use in alchemy do also correspond to things like the planets. They do also correspond to things like the Kabbalistic spheres, but you're really mostly thinking in elemental terms when you're doing alchemy stuff, compared to pretty much every part of Western esotericism when you're thinking in planetary or Kabbalistic terms. But of course, people who also did things like astrology were still using those terms. So you'll notice, you know, certain symbols used in alchemy look like symbols in other things. There are a lot of glyphs and symbols and sigils that we get from alchemy that you would probably recognize if you saw. So that all was kind of coming in together. So you've got a lot of different things coming in. But this idea of like pursuing knowledge and experimentation was really a big part of the alchemical tradition. Now, when we talk about spiritual alchemy, we are talking about those spiritual processes that I mentioned earlier. So you can do all sorts of ideas where you apply alchemical philosophy and alchemical principles to your spiritual journey. Alchemical spiritual journeys, or as they call it, inner alchemy or alchemy of the soul, basically does that, right? Like there's a lot of rituals that you can do. There's a lot of initiations. There's a lot of ways you can do this. And if you look at stuff that was coming out of the Christian mystical tradition at the time, you see a lot of very alchemical looking stuff. And if you look later, you go a little further in time, when you see things like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn coming up, you actually see a lot of alchemical influence on things. In fact, you can actually see the alchemical process as a series of initiations on its own. So you start as an impure thing, and then you invoke external things, right? You're now combining things. And then through that spiritual journey, you transmute yourself. You turn yourself into something different. And then you purify, and you keep purifying. And you do this process repeatedly. I think of, you know, in certain decks of tarot, the card Temperance is drawn as like a person overlooking this like bowl. Specifically, I think it's drawn this way in the Hermetic Tarot, but I know a couple decks do it this way, and I think of that image. I think of someone like standing over a forge or a pot, and that's kind of like the inner alchemy approach, right? Like you're taking yourself and you're mixing yourself in a hot pot, and you're turning yourself into something new repeatedly. This is a repeated process. This is an unfolding process. This is a cycle process, and I speak a lot about the Jungian cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And the alchemical process, when it comes to the alchemy of the soul, is a lot of that, right? It's life, death, rebirth, again and again and again and again and again and again. And I do find that spiritual techniques that use inner alchemy do use a lot more props and materials than some other traditions. Like if you're doing straight theurgy, like the ancient Greeks did, there's often not a lot of tools. For alchemy stuff, there's a lot of tools. Specifically, the creation of talismans through things like metallurgy come up a lot. Using these materials that people would use in physical alchemy have a lot of relevance. Obviously, you're not shooting up mercury, but you know, maybe don't use mercury at all, but like using, say, you know, a lead pentacle, though be careful with that, maybe not a lead one. Use another material, okay? There's other materials besides lead and mercury used in alchemy, okay? Like please don't poison yourself for some sort of spiritual point. I also would advise against like taking ancient alchemical recipes and just like making them in your kitchen, unless you know what the hell you're doing. But saying using gold, because gold was of course an ideal in alchemy, right? They were always trying to create gold because gold was a precious metal. So, you know, to represent like where you're going towards, like you would use gold. Also the use of banners, which are like little like flag-like things that you put on the wall. You can put them up with command strips. I think command strips should be in every occultist arsenal. I think they are created by the gods themselves, because you can just like hang things and take them down. Whatever, right? Using like different banners, like say for the elements, can be really, really valuable. Of course, invocation is a big part of this. If you are doing a sort of Christian approach to alchemy, invoking angels is going to be a big part of this process. And using the angels to help you along this journey is going to be a huge part of it. In general, I would say alchemy can kind of overlap with like every other practice. Like it's not like if you were to do inner alchemy, it's not really like you're just doing alchemy. Like you're going to be doing other stuff as well. And if you are interested in physical alchemy, there is one book that discusses it in a safe, modern way called Alchemy Rising the Green Book. And it is very, very good. It is like ancient text, but it gives like commentary. It's by the people over at Scarlet Imprint. And it is really, really good. And when I talk about alchemy as a philosophy, that's the other way alchemy can pop up. It can be a philosophy that you use to represent your spiritual growth or your life journey. Because the alchemists were reading so much philosophy, you know, alchemy can also be seen as a way of life. There was another thing that was happening philosophically with the alchemists where they were getting really into Aristotle and bringing back Aristotelianism, which is a philosophy that gets a lot less, you know, prized than like Platonism. But, you know, if you get really into Aristotle and Plato, like you should look up what the alchemists were writing about, what their philosophy was. Because, you know, these were very virtue-oriented people. They were knowledge-seeking people. They were a lot of the same people who are on these occult journeys as like what we desire, right? We desire knowledge. We desire closeness with the gods. We desire to purify our souls and become something better, to transmute ourselves from a lower form into something higher, something beyond where we are. And so reading this philosophy philosophy can even guide you forward. If you are on any sort of journey in your life where you're trying to change, the alchemical philosophy could actually really apply to your situation. And so, you know, I think the idea that alchemy is just like crackheads like in the like woods, like mixing like beakers or whatever people think it is nowadays. Like when people think of like someone who's a modern alchemist, they get really weird images in their head. It's not that. Now, physical alchemy is a thing, and if you do it like properly, like that can be like a really interesting thing. I remember I did like an herbalism thing with someone who had like a whole like alchemical setup, and it was very cool. Also kind of expensive to get into, but you know, it could be a thing for you if that's where you want to go. But the thing is, the more important thing is the spiritual alchemy, right? Alchemy is not really just meant to be like science experiments. It is meant to be a spiritual practice, right? There is no separating this. Like when people say alchemy is a proto-science, I think a big reason why that bothers me is that alchemy was a philosophy. Alchemy was a spiritual tradition, and there are modern people doing this. Now, I will say historically it has been more Christians. Nowadays, I think most people who are doing like alchemy are kind of like Hermeticists, Gnostics, Occultists, which, I mean, historically that's who that was too, but you see a lot more pagans. That's kind of where I'm getting at. Like people who are into Thelema or Wicca, like you see more of that than you would have historically. And so if you are of those traditions, don't count yourself out, like just because you're not Christian or whatever, which I'm not Christian if you guys didn't know this. I would hope you know this by now. But you know, like you can include this into really any spiritual tradition, because this idea of like purification, the reason why I use those other examples is because it's a perennial idea, right? It's one of those ideas that show up repeatedly. Because the thing is, if a spiritual truth is true, multiple cultures and multiple traditions are going to figure that thing out, right? Like it's not like one culture is going to figure that out and like no one else is ever going to have thought about that. Because if you go on any spiritual journey, this kind of happens to you anyways. So yeah, I mean, that's really what alchemy is on a spiritual, a philosophical, and a practical level. It is not what you think it is, though sometimes it can be that. And that's all I have to say. If you like me, please support me on Patreon. You get a bonus video every month. You get private mentorship sessions where you call with me and I give you spiritual advice. And you get a ritual guide every single month with detailed instructions on how to do rituals based upon the current astrology and seasons. I also am a professional astrologer and tarot reader. I provide tarot readings and planetary mediation-based astrology readings. Those are available on my website that is in the description below. And I also host the podcast Pagan Perspectives by Georgina Rose, which you can access on this channel or on all podcasting platforms under Pagan Perspectives by Georgina Rose. On that podcast, I talk about how to use esoteric philosophy and metaphysics to guide your lifestyle. It's a little less spiritual in nature, but it's like about how to apply spirituality to your mundane life. So a little bit different. And you can find me under Darling on every platform under the sun. All right, bye. Oh, one last thing. Like, comment, subscribe, and if you ring the bell and subscribe for 93 days, you'll meet your holy guardian angel and never need to know what alchemy is again. Okay, for real now. Bye!